Shabbat Shalom. That is the larger theme of the Dvar I want to offer. But thank you so much. I'm going to start with our Torah portion, Parshat Shemini. So what's going on in this part of the Torah? The Mishkan, the portable sanctuary that the Hebrews have constructed according to God's blueprint, and that they're going to take with them through their 40 years of wandering. It's built. They've just had a week-long consecration ceremony, and then when they're just about ready to open the Mishkan for sacrifices, to open for business, catastrophe happens. Two of Aaron's, the high priest's sons, Nadav and Avihu, bring some kind of unauthorized incense offering into the newly dedicated sacred space. And then the text tells us very little except that what they offered was an Eish Zara, a strange fire, a curious phrase that has puzzled commentators for 2,000 years. And then a blast of fire suddenly consumed the two young men, and they died. Shortly after this calamity, God, in this parsha, commands that the priests be responsible for the following. Lehavdil bein hakodesh uvein hachol, uvein hatameh, uvein hatahor. That they have to be able to distinguish properly between the sacred and the ordinary, between the impure and the pure. So, hold on to that for a moment. I'm going to come back to it, but first I want to come back to what Rabbi Noya was mentioning in introducing me to recap the main idea that I shared during last night's program, and that idea is that synagogues have a dual mission. They have a mission to be a Sukkot Shalom, a place of emotional and spiritual refuge, and they have a mission to be a Kol Tzedek, a voice lifted up for justice. And what I talked about last night was that what we're seeing across many of the congregations in our movement and beyond our movement is that when there's disagreement on the Kol Tzedek part of the mission, and there are people who may bitterly disagree with each other about what kind of action or stand they think is the right one for their synagogue to take in a crisis, then that becomes painful, and then very often there's a group in the middle that's not sure, and all of that tension has an impact on the other mission of the synagogue, to be a Sukkot Shalom, a place of safety and emotional comfort and refuge and community and all of the sweetness of the music of Shabbat as we've been experiencing it today, and all of those things. So it probably doesn't surprise you to hear that throughout the long history of the Jewish people, there have actually been many moments that have intensely and even harshly divided the Jewish community. And the Talmud includes detailed narratives about some of those moments. So I want to take us through an abridged version of one of the best known stories about one of those crisis moments. The story is often called the Oven of Achnai, or Achnai's Oven, and I'd like to ask if folks would be willing to raise your hands if you either have heard of this story or kind of know this story. It's always good to, and no judgment. Okay, right, so a small number of you know the story or have heard the story. The setting for this story, I will tell you after I open this. Intentional suspense setting. The setting for the story is among the first generation of rabbis who survived the great Roman destruction of Jerusalem and ancient Israel in the year 70 CE. And the story begins with a debate between Rabbi Eliezer and a whole group of rabbis that included one Rabbi Joshua. And the issue, and this is going to strike you as a devastatingly riveting issue, is the ritual purity status of certain kinds of communal ovens used in ancient times. I know, but hold on. Now, a piece of important background. In the generation after the Roman destruction, the early rabbis had developed a tradition of interpretation and debate regarding matters of Jewish law, halakha, Jewish law. And generally their practice was to use majority rule among the rabbis to determine the law. But they would preserve minority opinions in the official record. But Rabbinic Judaism's tradition of debate and majority rule was still young, and as this story will show, it was still open to being challenged as the method that the rabbis would use to decide religious and legal questions. Another important piece of context: in this generation of rabbis, Eliezer and Joshua are the two heavyweights. And Eliezer in particular is known for being a special kind of rabbinic superstar. He has a perfect memory. His arguments are airtight. His social skills are not so great. And he has become increasingly frustrated with having to accept the majority rulings of the other rabbis when he knows for certain that they're wrong. Too often, his opinion gets relegated to being listed as one of the minority views that doesn't determine halakha for his time. So, in this story, they're having this debate about the purity status of these ovens, and Eliezer is losing the argument with Joshua and the rest of the sages. And this time it's just the final straw for Eliezer. Here's where we'll jump into a translation of the text, and this is the part of the story that's best known. It was taught on that day. Rabbi Eliezer brought forward every imaginable argument, but the sages did not accept any of them. Finally, he said to them, Eliezer said, "If the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, let this carob tree prove it." And sure enough, the carob tree uprooted itself, flew through the air 100 cubits, and others say 400 cubits, and replanted itself. So the other rabbis said to him in response, "No proof can be brought from a carob tree." So again, and you know these kinds of stories happen in threes, right? So that was one. So again, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, "If the halakha agrees with me, let this nearby stream of water prove it." And sure enough, the stream of water miraculously stopped and then started flowing backwards. And the rabbis said, "No proof can be brought from a channel of water." So again, Rabbi Eliezer urged, "If the halakha agrees with me, let the walls of our house of study prove it." And sure enough, the walls tilted in and started to collapse. But Rabbi Joshua rebuked the walls. He rebuked the walls, saying to them, "When disciples of the wise are engaged in a Jewish legal debate, what right do you have to interfere?" In deference to Rabbi Joshua, the walls of the house of study did not fall all the way in. And in deference to Rabbi Eliezer, they did not fully resume their upright position. They are still today standing aslant. Rabbi Eliezer then said to the sages, remember how I said these things come in threes? So if you've exhausted three and then you're going up another level, Rabbi Eliezer then said to the sages, "If the halakha agrees with me, Let it be proved from heaven. And sure enough, a divine voice, known in Hebrew as a bat kol, cried out from the heavens, "Why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, with whom the halacha always agrees?" In other words, God speaks and says, "Why do you argue with this guy? He's right this time. He's been right every other single time too." So I'm going to interrupt this to comment a bit. So at this point, we're at peak tension. Eliezer has not only called for 3 miracles to back him up, and he's gotten them, but now a voice of God has come out of the heavens and told the rabbis to knock it off. Eliezer's always right. Let's just think about this moment for a second, because given the understanding all the ancient rabbis shared, that Judaism is first and foremost a religion that commands the Jewish people to obey God's instructions, right? You would think that this story would go on to tell us that the sages finally conceded the argument to Eliezer, since God had manifested before them and spoken. Whoa. And if this story had played out that way, the moral might have been that the majority rule will prevail most of the time in rabbinic debate, unless there is a great prophetic figure present who is backed up by miracles and God in front of witnesses, right? I mean, if Joshua and the other rabbis had submitted to God's intervention in favor of Eliezer, maybe the Talmud would then go on to record the story of the ascension of Rabbi Eliezer to a new position of authority, perhaps even presenting him as the redeeming prophet of the Jews of that era, and maybe even developing the rest of the Jewish religion along the lines of his teachings. After all, Rabbi Eliezer was a Jew who argued with the rabbis all arrayed against him. He summoned indisputable miracles in front of witnesses, and he was claimed by God by means of a heavenly voice. This is not an unfamiliar kind of story for 1st century and early 2nd century Jews. They've heard stories like this, right, in the region. But this is not what happens. Before we come back to the text, let's also remember one more thing, that over and over again in ancient rabbinic literature, we read that Eliezer was the rabbinic genius of his generation. And yet, this same Eliezer, in this debate, is threatening to kill the debate-oriented, majority rule-based rabbinic Judaism of Joshua and the rest of the sages, which has only just been born. When Eliezer calls on the walls of the house of study to support his position by doing something miraculous, the walls start to fall inward. One contemporary commentator writes, Eliezer is not just offering proof, he is literally threatening to tear down the institution to prove his point. It's not enough now for the sages to ignore Eliezer's supernatural proofs. They now have to see to the stability of the academy. And so it falls to Rabbi Joshua to address the walls, Rabbi Joshua being the only one there with the stature equivalent to Rabbi Eliezer's. So now let's return to the text. The divine voice has spoken, has told them all, what's the matter with you? Eliezer's right, he's always right. Rabbi Joshua stands up and protests to the divine voice, to the bat kol. And he quotes at the divine voice a small part of a verse in Deuteronomy. He says, "It is not in heaven," in a proclamatory way, and then he sits back down. So, sorry to be annoying. I have to hit pause on the narrative again in order to unpack the remarkable thing that's just happened. In this one sentence of Talmudic text, Joshua has done several things. First, he's now taken his argument, and that of the majority of the rabbis, to God, as well as to Eliezer. And there are a lot of wonderful things that we could discuss this morning, but we don't have time for, about why Joshua picked those words from the Torah and why he cited it in the way that he did. We're going to skip over that today because that's not the part of this story that relates most directly to the challenges members of congregations like HBT have been facing since October 7th, and this all will tie back to that. What matters for our purposes is that Joshua's retort succeeds. The divine voice says nothing more, and Eliezer understands, they all understand, that Joshua and the majority of the rabbis have prevailed. Now, there's a lot going on here. For one, it took a lot of chutzpah for Joshua to assert anything in the moment right after a divine voice from heaven just told everyone to knock it off and follow Eliezer's view. The only thing that might have helped Eliezer in this story would have been another divine intervention or an angel arriving and really saying, you gotta follow Eliezer. But there are no more miracles or divine voices in the story. Joshua's statement ends the argument, and the rabbis then confirm and enact their majority decision regarding the purity. Got a long way. Thank you. Hey. Good enough? I can project a little more. Okay, so, right. No more divine miracles. Joshua's statement ends the argument, and the rabbis confirm and enact their majority decision regarding the purity status of these ovens. And a foundational precedent is confirmed in Rabbinic Judaism, namely that halakha, Jewish law, will be determined by a majority vote of the rabbis of the time, and that even supernatural interventions by God cannot overrule majority decisions. Following Joshua's victory, the Talmud proceeds to tell a vignette that describes what God did at the moment that Joshua made his final winning argument. The text tells us that upon witnessing this, God laughed and said, "My children have defeated me, my children have defeated me." If this seems surprisingly irreverent, this text, after all, the Talmud is a Jewish sacred text, and ordinarily, what do we expect from sacred texts? We expect them to tell the humans what God wants, and for the humans to thankfully agree to comply. But this text really is irreverent and challenging, even though we've just been told that God ultimately supports what the majority of rabbis have done by laughing, by appreciating how they've sort of come of age in a certain way. But there's still more going on with the story, and actually right here in the story is often where folks who learn about this story, that's kind of where it ends. But there's a lot more to this story. And that's the part that especially interests me. Eventually, after this famous debate between Eliezer and all the other rabbis over Achnai's oven, the rabbis then voted to ban Eliezer from participating in all future rabbinic debates. They enacted a penalty called nidui, which is often semi-accurately translated as excommunication. I hesitate to use that word because it conjures up associations from Catholicism, and here it means something different, but it's very heavy. For the ancient rabbis, nidui meant that a rabbi could no longer take part in the debates and the voting matters on Jewish law. no other rabbis or students could get within a few meters distance of the person as well. So let's return to the text of the Talmud that narrates what took place after the debate and the victory for majoritarian democracy of the rabbis. We pick up the story right after the stunning scene in which Joshua and the majority of the rabbis have prevailed. The text continues, "On that day, the rabbis took all of the items that Eliezer had ever previously declared to be in a state of purity, and they burned them." So, right, one of the things rabbis in the ancient world at this time were called upon to do was to make legal judgment calls, decisions about whether something was pure or impure, and to us that may seem sort of superstitious and obscure, but what did we learn in our Torah portion? It's a matter of life and death to get the purity stuff correct in the ancient worldview of our ancestors, right? So these aren't small matters, and Eliezer has apparently frequently been asked to render judgment on whether certain items are pure or impure during his career, and he's said this is pure, that's pure to a whole bunch of items, and the majority of rabbis has now gathered all those items, and almost like a kind of book burning, they've set them all on fire. The text tells us then that the rest of the rabbis voted to excommunicate Eliezer, and once they did that, they looked to each other, and the text has the rabbis asked one another, "Who will go and inform Eliezer that we have excommunicated him?" Rabbi Akiva, who was a student of both Joshua and Eliezer, says, "I'll do it," so that somebody without understanding and sensitivity does not end up telling him the news in an unskillful way, which could cause the entire world to be destroyed. Now, why would Rabbi Akiva say that the entire world might be destroyed if this news wasn't conveyed carefully to Eliezer? Was he exaggerating? In a word, no. In the world of mythic rabbinic stories, the great rabbis are sometimes depicted as having supernatural influence on the forces of nature. Eliezer is one of these giants among the rabbis. Remember, he was able to summon multiple miracles. So Akiva's concern is literal. He doesn't know what kinds of cosmic forces might be unleashed if Eliezer is brought down hard. What did Rabbi Akiva do? The Talmud says, he dressed in black garments, he went to Eliezer's home, and then he sat down from Eliezer at a distance of 4 amot, like 10 meters, the required distance. Eliezer said to him, "Akiva, what's unusual about today?" And Akiva said, "My master, it appears to me that your colleagues have distanced themselves from you." Rabbi Eliezer then tore his clothes, removed his shoes, and sat down on the ground. His eyes overflowed with tears. And in that instant, 1/3 of the harvests of the earth were spoiled. 1/3 of the olive crops, 1/3 of the wheat, 1/3 of the barley, and some say that even the dough in the hands of women abruptly spoiled. It was taught by the ancient sages what happened was so significant that on that same day, everywhere that Eliezer cast his gaze was burnt up. So what we see in this story is that the forces of nature are ambivalent about Eliezer's excommunication. Just as cosmic forces displayed ambivalence during the oven debate. Remember, In deference to Eliezer, the walls started to fall. In deference to Joshua, they started to rise back up, and they stayed slanted. Ambivalence. So the only moment when Joshua, by the way, in that story, actually responds with some supernatural wand waving of his own. I bring this up because one of the most worthwhile aspects of this rabbinic story and others like it is the way that it gives expression to ambivalence, even to divine ambivalence in vivid ways. In multiple ways, actually, the Talmud expresses its conflictedness about the Achnai's oven excommunication of Eliezer's story and the big issues it addresses. Yes, Joshua's side wins the day and establishes a system of majoritarian interpretivism, which is Judaism as we know it, rabbinic Judaism as we know it. We love it. Multiple opinions, side by side, preserving minority views. One day we might need them, change to them. Different opinions. We love it. But the story also makes clear to us that Joshua and the other rabbis who opposed Eliezer were wrong about the truth. They were wrong. Furthermore, the Talmud, as one scholar puts it, while affirming Joshua's rule, is not afraid to point out that Eliezer remains heaven's favorite. The Talmudic story goes on to describe the things that the community did to Eliezer as going way too far, and as an example of one of the most serious sins that the Talmud spends a whole lot of pages discussing. It's a sin called ona'ah in Hebrew, and we don't have time to unpack it, but it is a very particular and painful kind of humiliating harm created by a person or a group of people towards someone. I want to read a quote from a contemporary scholar, a person named Daniel Greenwood. He writes, "This story, with the sad account of Akiva telling Eliezer of his excommunication and Eliezer's subsequent misery, helps us see how important it is for the rabbis to keep those who lose the debates within the community, even if those individuals threaten the democratic system of the rabbis itself." Greenwood says, "It is Eliezer who is known for behavior that makes community impossible. Eliezer is the man with special access to the truth, and uncompromising truth is incompatible with a democratic society. Those who know the truth have no reason to bow to the majority. Like Eliezer, they can appeal to heaven. Only by excluding Eliezer's claim to special privilege could the rabbinic community continue. But the Talmudic story, if you go all the way to the end, seems to say that only by respecting Eliezer's claim to the truth can the world endure." So this section of the Talmud suggests the idea of a nation as a community of dialogue. And the excommunication failed because in the end, Eliezer is still part of the conversation. He needs to be part of the conversation. So one more quote, and then I'm kind of going to wrap up here. In 2015, there was a debate that kind of erupted within the Israeli press there were a number of Israeli groups, progressive political Israeli groups, Jewish-dominant Israeli groups, who were starting to take a stand that crossed a lot of traditional red lines, and it was about the sort of classical Israeli formulation of Israel being a Jewish state. And so these were some folks, Jews on the Israeli left, who wanted to reformulate that, and the Jewish part was still part of their equation, but it was severely demoted and secondary to the democracy state of all of its citizens ideals. And so some of these groups spoke out, and then they got a lot of verbal rocks thrown at them, predictably, by people all across the political spectrum in Israel. Everybody was really just sending down a lot of rage at these particular groups. So in addressing that debate, Rabbi Daniel Hartman from the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem wrote an op-ed. And he wrote this: "No society that embraces free speech and dissent as essential gets to pick its critics or set the parameters within which they function. The nature of vibrant criticism and ideological dissent is that someone will always violate some line and engage in actions that some find reprehensible. In fact, it is precisely by crossing these lines that critics garner the necessary attention to catalyze public debate. The Jewish people's boundaries were always porous and vague. Judaism was never a religion of simple black or white. The lines between the heretic and the faithful, the insider and the outsider, were always gray. We survived because we had an almost infinite capacity to tolerate differences, including those we felt to be dangerous. This tolerance gave birth to a society of debate and self-criticism that is the bedrock of our moral aspirations. Today, it is precisely this tolerance which is also our most strategic ally, for it is there that our greatest security and strongest defense will be found." I just want to leave you with the invitation to connect some of these themes to the tensions in this synagogue and in other similar synagogues across the country that are struggling to be both a Sukkot Shalom and a Kol Tzedek. And to recognize and understand that on the Kol Tzedek side of the ledger, we have a lot of congregations where there are competing views that are in conflict with each other about what the moral calling, what advocacy stand is required or has been required by the crisis of the last 6 months. That what I talked about yesterday was every congregation is unique and different, but in many congregations, there are some, let's just sort of go for the analogy, there are some Eliezers who feel very, very strongly that the moral calling is one for immediate ceasefire and for first and foremost prioritizing preventing the slaughter of innocents. And there are also some Eliezers who are wanting the Kol Tzedek voice of their synagogue to rise up in the moment, who have felt that first and foremost, the message and the calling has to be to protect Israel from future attacks like that which took place on October 7th, to protect its existential existence under circumstances that folks in that camp feel are far more fragile than conventional wisdom tends to believe, and that also assigns responsibility for the suffering of innocent people in Gaza, largely to Hamas. And that group of Eliezers feels very certain that what their synagogue should be doing is doing more of a kind of standing with Israel in the public square that reflects that framing. And in many of our congregations, then between those two groups of Eliezers are a whole lot of Joshuas, a whole lot of folks who tend to dwell much more in the place of doubt and uncertainty, and whose opinions may be fluid from week to week or even day to day, and who may feel a great deal of uncertainty. If there's wisdom that the Achnai's oven and Eliezer story may have to offer, It's this, I think. One, that when there is intense disagreement about what the moral calling for the moment might be, synagogues, and especially those in the Reconstructionist movement, which deeply values local democratic decision-making, which means respecting the will of the majority, there has to be space for the majority to possibly be wrong. And so that would be a call on folks who are Eliezers to cultivate greater tolerance. If they seek to persuade and at the end of the day are unable to persuade their synagogue as a whole to chart the path they would have liked to have seen, then I think the calling or the hope of these texts is to urge them not to quit, not to walk away from the community, but to recognize that this is part of the fabric of how congregations function and work. The flip side is also true, that if there are members who are Eliezers and who maybe don't see their congregation taking action in the way they wished, and whose response to that is to double down and continue to try hard to persuade, as uncomfortable or difficult as that might feel for the majority of folks in the congregation, the urging of this Talmudic story is to try to avoid making the mistake of banishing the insistent dissenter. That too is a mistake that comes with heavy consequences. So I leave you with all of that as food for thought, and I thank you for giving me the time to speak at greater length on all of this stuff. Shabbat Shalom.